Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Maddie and I'm a type 1 diabetic with a passion for people. I explore all things diabetes, and today we are focusing on the glycemic index and how it affects blood sugar. If this type of content interests you, consider subscribing to my channel and finding my blog at cheeverwellness.com, which I will link below. Like I said, today we are talking about glycemic index, and I'll also differentiate between high and low glycemic index foods. Then we will discuss glycemic load, which sounds similar but is different. I have an example which we will work through together so I can show you exactly what I mean. Finally, I'll discuss blood sugar management directly. Let's get started. Let's discuss glycemic index. It's a carbohydrate ranking scale based on how carbohydrates or carbs will theoretically affect blood sugar. Let's quickly review carbohydrates as well. This is one of the three main macronutrients. As a note, the other two are protein and fat, and they provide the body with energy like calories. Carbs specifically provide energy to the body in the form of sugar or starch and can be found in many fruits, vegetables, milk or dairy products, grains, and of course, sweets. Like I said, their score is based on how they raise blood sugar or glucose levels after consumption. For clarification, pure glucose is the standard or reference, and it increases the blood sugar the quickest. Also, glycemic index is based on quality. That doesn't necessarily mean how good or bad a food is. It's about the type of carbohydrate and how it will release in the body. Is it fast acting or slow acting? A memory trick I like to use is lower is slower. The glycemic index is split into categories of low, medium, and high. A low glycemic index score is 55 or less, and high is 70 or above. This is based on how it is used in your body and if it reacts slowly or quickly. This is shown by how it affects blood sugar. Think of this in terms of caffeine. A shot or 1 ounce of espresso would provide more caffeine than 1 ounce of a regularly brewed coffee. They can be very similar, but espresso is much more concentrated. This is kind of similar to how the glycemic index works. Now that we know what the glycemic index is and how to differentiate between high and low values, here are some examples of foods you may commonly consume or see. Like with our caffeine reference, many of these foods may seem the same, like the grapefruit and an orange, but they can actually have a very different glycemic index ranking. For these 5 categories, the lowest glycemic index value of each category can be found at the top of the list, and the highest value can be found at the bottom of the list. This table is not all-inclusive, it's just a very small example of some of the foods you may normally see. So let's focus on our grains and dairy here. If we specifically look at our bread, we can swap white bread, which has a glycemic index of 100, for whole wheat bread, which has a glycemic index of 71, which is approximately a 30% decrease. And if you notice the dairy table, the difference between a fruit-flavored yogurt and a plain or low-fat yogurt is about 20%, which is based on the 0 to 100 glycemic index scale. These are just a few examples. As a note, this is simply an educational guide and is not meant to be a judgment in any way, shape, or form. Please eat what works best for you and your needs. Life is about balance, and the glycemic index is not the only factor. Food varies greatly, but here is a simplified guide to figure out if a glycemic index might be high or low. A food that is high in soluble fiber, which is essentially a fiber that can dissolve in water and helps with digestion, can lower the glycemic index of a food. This is found in many fruits and vegetables. Another factor that can lower the glycemic index of a food is if it has fat or protein. This is because these macronutrients are absorbed more slowly in the body, and also perhaps because a food like this might have less carbs. Again, the glycemic index is based on carbohydrates. However, it's important to remember that the glycemic index is not the only measure of health. As we know, A high-fat diet might not be as great, but it could potentially have a very low glycemic index score. On the opposite side, fruit is very good for you, but can have a high glycemic index. Finally, processed foods are likely to have a high glycemic index because they have many added sugars or other substances. Now that we've discussed the glycemic index and high versus low foods, let's talk about the glycemic load. This is a measure of quantity as opposed to the glycemic index, which is quality, and it has to do with carbohydrate servings. So essentially, what is your portion size? The equation to figure out glycemic load uses the glycemic index. So if you take the glycemic index and multiply it by the amount of carbs in the serving size divided by 100, that is the glycemic load. And I have an example that we will go through soon. Before we do that though, let's talk about the table because it's not always true. So Fitness Genes suggests that the glycemic load of carrots is 2. However, this could change depending on the serving that you have. So let's say, for example, you have 11 servings of these carrots, then that's the same glycemic load as the French fries, which is high. That's not necessarily unhealthy, that's just something to keep in mind. A big takeaway here is to make sure to do your research. Let's go through this example together so that I can show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use watermelon today. The seemingly agreed upon glycemic index for watermelon is approximately 72. However, this can vary depending on ripeness and other factors, but for the sake of this video, let's just say it's accurate. To use the equation, we use the glycemic index and multiply that by the carbohydrates in the serving of our watermelon. So if we have a half a cup of watermelon, we multiply 72 by 3.7 carbs, then divide by 100, and that gives us 2.7, or we can round to 3. If we do that again with a full cup of watermelon, we multiply 72 by 7.5 carbs, then divide that by 100, and we get 5.4, which can be rounded to 5. So the glycemic index never changed, but the glycemic load actually doubled because the portion doubled. They're directly related. Now that we know the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load, let's talk about how this affects blood sugar specifically. It's important to combine the index and the load, or the quality and the quantity, in order to get the full picture. So let's use pizza as an example. Pizza is our quality or glycemic index rating because it tells us exactly what we're eating. We know that we're having pizza, this is the quality. Then we also need to know how much we're eating, or in this case, how many slices. This gives us a quantity, and these two together are the full picture. So not only do you have to know what you're eating and how much, but you have to combine these two. Let's say I had 6 slices. If you didn't know it was pizza, you might think I was talking about a small apple or something else, and that would affect the full picture very differently. For a type 1 diabetic, this would cause a great change in the amount of insulin that they would need. For someone else, this could also greatly affect their medication. Do you remember what the glycemic index of pure glucose is? Did you get it? It's 100. Pure glucose is a fast-acting blood sugar fix, much like honey or glucose tablets and also candy. These are great in an emergency, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily the best all the time. They're quickly broken down by the body, which is why their glycemic index is high and why they spike the blood sugar. If it's not an emergency, planning for after the low blood sugar is also very important. Let's talk about trends. Here, I'm comparing foods that will have a more steady effect on the blood sugar versus the fast-acting glucose that we have just mentioned. Once the fast-acting energy is used, it's gone. It's no longer available, which can lead to a blood sugar crash later. Remember earlier we mentioned how protein and fat are low on the glycemic index. So this is because they digest slower or are used less quickly and will sustain energy as well as blood sugar. That is why combinations like milk and crackers or apples and peanut butter are recommended by dietitians for diabetics. It combines a high glycemic index food, which will spike the blood sugar quickly, with a food that has protein and or fat that will break down slowly and maintain blood sugar so that the blood sugar doesn't crash later. Our final point for blood sugar management is that balance and moderation are key. High glycemic index foods act more quickly, so the body works harder to maintain a balance. This is especially important for people with type 2 diabetes, which is characterized by insulin resistance. This resistance can happen to type 1 diabetics as well, so it's important for everyone to eat a healthy, balanced diet. High glycemic index is not the enemy, and carbs are important energy. However, being mindful of the source is also important. If a slight increase in blood sugar comes from fruit, as opposed to something like processed sweets, it can offer fiber, vitamins, mineral, water, and other things that are beneficial to the body that the sweets do not also offer. So let's recap. First, we learned that the glycemic index is a carbohydrate ranking from 0 to 100 that indicates how the blood sugar will be affected. It is a measure of quality because of how it reacts, which can be slow or quick. Next, we discussed some specific foods that have high and low values and some lower glycemic index alternatives. Then we differentiated between glycemic index and glycemic load and determined that glycemic load is a measure of quantity, like a portion size. We also discussed how the same food can have different glycemic load values because, again, it is based on serving sizes. Finally, we discussed 4 helpful ways that this information can be used for blood sugar management. This includes measuring insulin, acting on low blood sugars, maintaining glucose levels, and avoiding insulin resistance. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you are passionate about diabetes, or just curious and want to know more, consider subscribing and follow me on my blog at cheeverwellness.com. Until next time.